The New York Times called it a story that shocked the scientists in April. But it is but only one of the mysteries in a novel coronavirus, claimed to be a zoonotic evolution from a species of bats with no known human cure. But on January 21st, the headline simply read in the New York Times, "First patient with Wuhan coronavirus is identified in the U.S." It continued, "A man in Washington state is infected with a new respiratory virus. Federal officials plan to expand screenings for the infection at major airports." Today in Washington state, there are 27,200 confirmed cases of infection, responsible for 1,220 deaths, which calculates into a 4.4% mortality rate, 2.3% short of a local epidemic according to the CDC threshold. But remarkably, according to the Bing surgeon, 0 recoveries. And as of May 13th, according to U.S. News and World Report, long-term care residents, workers, and visitors account for 61% of the deaths in the Evergreen state. So join us for a moment to review unsolved mysteries in the case of America's Patient Zero, the case that even baffled the scientists. On January 21st, Roni Karen Raven reported in the New York Times that a man in his 30s and a resident of Snohomish County in Washington state was infected with the Wuhan coronavirus, the first confirmed case in the United States of a mysterious respiratory infection that has killed at least 6 people and sickened hundreds more in Asia, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention announced that day. Federal officials also announced expanded screenings for the infection at major airports in the United States. In addition to New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, airports in Atlanta and Chicago would begin examining passengers arriving from Wuhan, China, for signs of illness. The infected man, who was in his 30s and a resident of Snohomish County, named for the American Indian tribe in 1861 in the vicinity of Everett, Washington, a little over 25 miles north of Seattle, along Interstate 5, developed symptoms after returning from a trip to the region around Wuhan where the outbreak began on January 15th, just 2 days before passenger screening was instituted at 3 major airports in the United States. But, according to reports, he had no symptoms at the time. After developing symptoms, he made a connection between his recent return from Wuhan and reports he had read online about the mysterious new virus that causes fever and respiratory illnesses. And on January 19th, the Sunday after his return from China, he informed doctors at a clinic in Snohomish County about his recent trip. Shortly thereafter, the infected patient was hospitalized at Providence Regional Medical Center in Everett, presenting symptoms of a mild case of pneumonia, and specimens were sent to the CDC in Atlanta, where officials confirmed on January 20th that he was infected with the Wuhan coronavirus. And healthcare workers immediately began to attempt to identify people who may have had contact with the infected traveler, including passengers on his return flight who might have been exposed. And at that point, everything appeared to be routine, at least for a contagion that by January 31st had become a public health emergency of international concern, as declared by the World Health Organization. Today, according to the Snohomish County Department of Health, there have been a total of 3,136 cases of infection in that county, responsible for 156 deaths, but also conflicting with the Bing search engine tally, which found 0 recoveries in the state of Washington. Snohomish County alone reports over 3,000 recovery cases. including the Wuhan traveler, identified as being 35 years old, who was released from the hospital on February 3rd, as reported by King 5, the NBC affiliate in Seattle. At the time of his release, the NBC affiliate reported that the virus had infected more than 17,000 people and spread to 24 countries, and that the virus-related deaths in China then exceeded more than 350. They continued to maintain that the outbreak initially was connected to a seafood market in the central city of Wuhan, but human-to-human transmission made the virus spread more quickly and widely. After release, the 35-year-old Wuhan traveler was placed in monetary quarantine at home and issued the following statement: "I am at home and continuing to get better," he said. "I would like to thank the doctors, nurses, and entire team at Providence who cared for me. I appreciate all of the concern expressed by members of the public, and I look forward to returning to my normal life." But the situation, according to Mike Baker and Sherry Fink at the New York Times, is far from normal. On March 17th, Breitbart reported that Trevor Bedford, an expert virologist, had linked 39 cases of infection in Washington state to the Wuhan traveler, based upon genetic sequencing that had verified that 35 of 39 virus specimens collected from infected Washington patients shared a 90% match with the genetic cluster of the Wuhan traveler. The story emerged around the same time that multiple sources were beginning to attempt to calculate exactly how many other Wuhan travelers may have departed Asia before the Chinese locked down Wuhan on January 23rd. While many travelers were returning from Chinese New Year celebrations, or before the president suspended immigration from China on January 31st. One expert reported on February 9th to the Washington Times that as many as 5 million people may have departed Wuhan before that transportation hub in the central mainland of China began its lockdown. On April 4th, the New York Times estimated that as many as 430,000 travelers had departed China before the lockdown who were bound for the United States. And the narrative that a 35-year-old man presented himself to an urgent care clinic in Snohomish County, Washington, complaining of a 4-day history of a cough and subjective fever had aesthetic appeal. But by April 22nd, many in the science community were no longer certain that the Wuhan traveler was even the patient zero who had infected 39 others in Washington state. Because like the patient zero reported in Wuhan, who possessed no connection to the animal market, researchers could find no other confirmed connection to the patients he was alleged to have infected. How is this possible, you may ask? On May 22nd, in response to comments received about confusing guidance, the CDC clarified its guidance on how infection was spread, stating, "The primary and most important mode of transmission for COVID-19 is through close contact from person to person. Based on data from lab studies on COVID-19 and what we know about similar respiratory diseases, it may be possible that a person can get COVID-19 by touching a surface or object that has the virus on it, and then touching their own mouth, nose, or possibly their eyes. But this isn't thought to be the main way the virus spreads. But if infection is spread from person to person, when a person coughs, sneezes, or talks within 6 feet, the question posed by the Wuhan traveler, patient zero, is exactly how he managed to come in close contact with at least 68 people, none of whom ever became infected. Not one passenger on an almost 20-hour flight from Wuhan to Seattle with whom patient 0 came in contact has been identified as having been infected. The Uber driver who transported patient 0 nearly 25 miles from SeaTac Airport in Seattle to Snohomish County was not infected. Colleagues with whom he participated in a business lunch were not infected, but somehow 39 other people throughout the state of Washington were infected by a novel coronavirus that, like helical groovings created from rifling that enables the ballistics expert to match a shell casing to only one weapon, matched the specimens collected from patient 0. Which could only mean that patient 0 was not the shooter, but just another victim of someone or something else who has yet to be identified and who had to have been aboard his flight from Wuhan. But even if patient 0 did not infect the 39 others in Washington state, how did he fail to infect at least 68 other people while violating social guidance, not wearing a mask, not staying within 6 feet, not doing any of the things that public guidance currently tells us to do to avoid infection? On May 26th, the CDC published a study conducted on 359 patients, median age of 35, the same age as the American patient 0, and ranging in stages of infection regarding secondary transmission among infected patients in the incubatory period. They concluded that close contacts of persons in the incubatory period had the lowest potential for infection, that they risked significantly more chance of infection after development of mild symptoms, and were almost twice as infectious when they escalated from mildly symptomatic to severe symptoms. But most significantly, they concluded that close contacts that live with an infected patient had 12 times the risk for infection. Those who had frequent contact with an infected patient, greater than 5 contacts over 2 days, had 29 times the risk for infection. The pathology of this sequence explains the increasing infectiousness of a person afflicted with a respiratory tract infection, based upon what virologists and epidemiologists describe as a viral load. And a study published by researchers from Guangdong in the New England Journal of Medicine on March 19th concluded, based upon observations from January 7th to January 26th of 14 patients with a median age of 59 and ranging in age from 26 to 76, who had returned from Wuhan, but none of whom had visited the Huanan seafood wholesale market within 14 days before symptom onset, that higher viral loads were detected soon after symptom onset, with higher viral loads detected in the nose than in the throat. But also that viral load that was detected in the patients in the incubation period was similar to that in symptomatic patients, suggesting a potential for transmission from minimally symptomatic patients. Think of the infected person as a shotgun with the potential to launch multiple infectious particles in a cough or sneeze in the form of droplets. At least 3,000 in a cough, at least 4,000 in a sneeze. The natural immune system response to an infection in the respiratory tract. But potential for infection rises with the onset of disease because even though there is a high viral load, there is little opportunity to shed the particles lacking the symptomatic response of a cough or a sneeze.
But examining the 35-year-old patient zero, who endured a 20-hour flight as well as a 25-mile ride share to his home from the airport, who reported to a clinic 4 days after return from Wuhan, presenting with symptoms of cough and fever, and who was hospitalized for 2 weeks for pneumonia-like symptoms. He certainly had the maximum viral load potential to infect others, even if not with an infectious dose in the state of Washington, but based upon the pathology of the disease, also the potential to have infected others, because according to the CDC, the incubation period for COVID-19 is thought to extend to 14 days, with a median time of 4 to 5 days from exposure to symptoms onset. One study reported that 97.5% of persons with COVID-19 who develop symptoms will do so within 11.5 days of SARS-CoV-2 infection. So despite arrival at SeaTac International Airport on January 15th, the American patient zero may have been infected as early as January 1st, long before he even got on the plane, enabling him to infect everyone aboard his flight from Wuhan, the Uber driver, his business colleagues, and all of the other 68 persons identified to have come in contact with him before he reported to the clinic and was hospitalized on January 19th. But not even one such victim has yet been found. The case study subject contradicts all current guidance on social distancing and greatly contrasts with the findings of the CDC that probability of infection increased substantially among close contacts. But further, with the factor of a 20-hour airline flight, raises implications for findings that those who share living environments or have frequent contact with an infected case patient might be more likely to contract an infection simply from those standard transmission methods of a communicable disease. Moreover, in the state of Washington, the patient zero identified by federal legislators lacks any connection to any of the elderly residents well within the age cohort early identified by the World Health Organization and the CDC as the most vulnerable to infection at the Life Care Center of Kirkland, Washington, which was an epicenter of COVID-19 cases in the early days of the pandemic, and who now face a fine of more than $611,000 if they do not correct problems found by federal inspectors, who have cited that facility for failing to have a system in place that ensured timely action related to an identified respiratory outbreak within the facility, as well as for failing to recognize all possible systemic risks and concerns related to this known outbreak. That facility had less than a month to prepare for an unthinkable contingency. But after 6 months, public health officials have ignored the fact that the Wuhan traveler blamed for introducing the pathogen to the United States and the state of Washington invalidates the very protocols that have been created to prevent infection of others. And even today, even in the state where the only physician is serving as the governor, over half of the deaths to what has been called a pandemic pathogen are the elderly in nursing homes that his lockdown orders failed to prevent. More likely than not, because they failed to recognize the fact that what has been described as a communicable disease may well be, in fact, a biological weapon of terror, which is the only way to explain the mystery of the first case of infection in patient zero, the traveler from Wuhan. My name is Major Mike Webb, and I am running for U.S. Congress with liberty, honor, and excellence. By God, we shall make America great again. Honest.
This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb.